sometimes when you come to a theosophical class for the first time or something, you should kind of get this like, all these principles of a human being thrown at you. This thing where we're like, oh, man is sevenfold. There's 7 different aspects or parts of man, and so on and so on. And it seems kind of, I think for the average person, it seems like a way out there idea. But it doesn't matter what philosophy you subscribe to. You could be the most hardcore materialist, or you could be Buddhist or Christian or Jewish, or it doesn't matter. Every system has some view of what man is and what the parts are, so to speak, parts or aspects or whatnot. They just differ in their point of view on it. And Theosophy, it's not like Theosophy is the first thing to ever say, oh, man is composed of all these different parts. Right?
No, but especially in the West, before, I would say, the movement came out publicly again in 1875, a sevenfold constitution was pretty much non-existent in the mind of ordinary people. Of course, you'll find some references to it probably here and there in secret societies, but even then, the fundamental thing is that no matter how much you cut, or we cut ourselves up in parts, so to speak, they are fundamentally still one. So you can say, well, there's only one number one, the sum total of who we are, no matter how many principles are a part of it. Or you can say, okay, we're twofold. We have a spiritual aspect and we have a physical aspect. And then HPB, primarily in ISIS, referred to a threefold constitution, where she divided into, from the bottom up, you could say physical, then there is a soul, but there's also a spirit. And that element of spirit and soul, especially in Christianity, seems to be a little bit confusing, even to themselves, because they rarely make a distinction to it. So in Christianity, you could say we are twofold, a soul and a body. And spirit is somewhere hanging in between or equated with the idea of soul. But in Theosophy, especially in Isis Unveiled, the first magnum opus of HPB, she presented the threefold constitution, which then expanded in the secret doctrine into a sevenfold constitution. And that is also then the beginning of something more, to which we can refer much later on. We don't need to go that deep into it. So,
yeah, because you can go to 10 and 12 and 49 if you want to. There's all kinds of different ways that you can think about it, right? But it gets more and more complex. But for a beginner, it's good to start with the basics.
Yep. And then yoga, for instance, has different divisions, which, by the way, include the 7 that we're speaking of in Theosophy, and so do the Vedantins with their koshas. How many are there? 6 koshas or something?
Yeah, Atma and 5 koshas. Yeah. Well, let's explore all those in a minute. Yeah, exactly. Let's explore, a bunch of the different ways that we can look at that, because there's a Greek system. There's, like you've already brought up, sort of Christian. You could say the exoteric, or the most like outwardly known Christian, is basically just body and soul, and then the sort of deeper idea is body, soul, spirit, like you said. And there's a verse that HBB points out from Paul, which is, I don't remember the exact verse, but it's in Thessalonians, where he makes that division of body, soul, and spirit. And she was pointing that out to the Christians, being like, well, you guys are using the word soul and spirit as synonyms, but actually Paul makes a distinction, and here's where he makes a distinction. And so it is in Christianity, that distinction, which is important to know, right?
Most people don't make that distinction, or are not aware of it. And then you also have the Platonic approach, and that's also, by the way, a spirit, soul, and body with a nous. And
exactly. Yeah.
So it can become very confusing, our makeup.
Exactly. And the thing is there's a lot of similarities between the different systems. So we can discuss them, and then we can kind of bring them together and show like how they connect together. Because that's one of the important things that Theosophy does, is it says, it's not saying this idea of of man being sevenfold or having these different principles is exclusively theosophical in the sense of a modern movement. It's saying it shows up in all these different systems, and they talk about it with different terms, of course. They use different languages, but there's like really common similarities there. But I was thinking, why don't we start off with, like, we should define a couple terms first, because that sort of, for a newcomer, I think there's kind of three terms that we should maybe define right away. One is constitution, because we need to distinguish that between, like, a legal document, or what do we mean by constitution. And then principle and vehicle are the other two. I feel like right off the start, you kind of want to have an idea of what those words mean in Theosophy. So I don't know, do you want to get us started on that? Like, how do you define those terms?
Well, a constitution, I mean, it's definitely not the American Constitution. It's rather, you could say, the way how a human being is made up, you know. And just like a constitution consists of parts, the Constitution of the United States, well, yeah, so our makeup of who we are is also constituted of different parts, you could say, or you can maybe even better the word function. Because what is the purpose even of a political constitution? That is, how are we going to make this function? And those functions are represented in there. It's the same for our human makeup. So when we speak of that sevenfold constitution, each one of them represents a function and even sub-functions, etc., etc. No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good start. What's the distinction that we can make between principle and vehicle? I think those are the two most common terms we'll use, and in Theosophy, one of the principles, for example, we'll get into the details on the principles in a minute, but one of the principles is Buddhi. Okay, well, there's a Sanskrit term Buddhi. Well, you'll find Buddhi expressed as a principle. You'll also find it expressed as a vehicle, and sometimes I think we stumble over, well,
And as
why
a
is it two?
function. Yeah.
And as
When
a
we think
function,
of the
yeah.
word
So,
wisdom, for instance, then wisdom is not a vehicle. Well, no, it's a function. Its function is wisdom. So constitution, you could say, is sort of the sum total, whether you refer to it as a principle or a vehicle, they both constitute the makeup of man. And then you can look into the specifics. You say, okay, there is a consciousness aspect to it, and there is a vehicular aspect to it, because consciousness cannot manifest unless there is a vehicle to manifest through. Otherwise, consciousness just remains potential. But potentiality doesn't mean it doesn't exist, like we said in the beginning. It just is. So the problem in Theosophy is that whether they refer to the consciousness aspect of it or the vehicular aspect of it, they still use the same terminology, basically. When we refer to Buddhi, yeah, are you referring to wisdom? Are you referring to Buddhi as a vehicle or Buddhi as a substance? So you have to make that up from the context, obviously. Context is very important in the study of Theosophy.
yeah, as you were describing that, I was thinking one of the easier examples for people to wrap their heads around might be mind. In the theosophical view, mind is one of the principles. That's essentially, when the Christians, when Paul says spirit, soul, and body, the word for soul there is suke or psyche, right? And that's
So,
the word we
yeah.
use for mind. So soul, mind are very much together as a concept in our culture, right? But so one of the principles is mind, and then we could say, yeah, we can think of mind as a principle, and we can also think of mind as substantial. So, like, the principle is kind of like the reality behind the
Yeah,
substantial
that's a good
part of it, right?
definition for it. The first, in the sense that it always existed.
Exactly.
So, but even the word mind, psyche, and so forth, even those are confusing, even in our society. Or spirit, even more so. When you're in Europe, say in Belgium or in Holland or in Germany, and you say, my spirit, you're not referring to the highest principle in man, you're referring to mind. Whereas in the United States, we make more of a distinction among those two differences, you could say. No?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So when we get into each of the different principles slash vehicles, we can kind of examine what we mean by that in the case of each one, because each one will have a bit of a different flavor in how we define it, right? I was thinking one of the other parts is to kind of, when we ask the question like what are we also inherently in that have like an origin question, like where did we come from? That's all kind of like the what are we and the where did we come from question are kind of bundled together most of the time. And when we talk about the different parts of man, one of the unique things in Theosophy is the way it approaches where we or where the parts of us come from. Because if you take a Christian perspective, you'd say, well, there's God, and God made man, and
Simple.
nice and simple, direct line. There's a being, God created man. There you are. But in Theosophy, you have a broader system. We touched upon in a previous episode on the idea of hierarchies. And so in Theosophy, there's this idea that each principle has, to some degree, a kind of unique source. Like you said, they're all one, but they're also distinct in some unique way, right?
Yeah. Just like those hierarchies, they're all one, but they're also distinct at the same time. And that goes back to that idea in HVB Secret Doctrine on volume 38, that every entity consists of lesser developed entities and is itself on its own plane a part of other entities that make up a higher entity. And that goes apparently on for quite a bit and downwards almost ad infinitum, you could say.
Yeah. For a newcomer, probably one of the easier ways it's very materialistic type of a view, but you can abstract it to other things. One of the easier ways to get your head around it is to think of the human body. And we can divide the human body up into all kinds of things. We got a trunk and arms and legs and a head and a brain, and we got all these different organs. We can think of it in terms of systems.
Molecules, you name it.
Totally. Circulatory system, reproductive system, digestive system, all these different things. And they're all distinct in some way, and yet they function as a single whole harmoniously, we hope, right? So the principles follow that same kind of idea.
Yeah, when you look at the human being with all its functions, those functions are represented by organs. So you could say those, and we're not only referring to the stomach or the liver or something. Organs also means in that context the whole nervous system, the whole blood circulation. They're smaller systems, but they're distinct from others. But then when you look into each distinct organ, say like a stomach, well, the stomach is a unit. It's one, like an individual, one. Then you go deeper into it and you discover that it is made up of cells. Each of those cells is one, distinct, but altogether they make up the stomach. Well, those cells then in turn are made up of molecules. Each molecule is distinct. Same principle. And you can go further into the atomic because molecules are made up of atoms. Atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then those protons and neutrons are made up of quarks. And now even the quarks consist of quarks. So you see that application of a formula that runs through everything. And you could even say in a certain sense, okay, then on our level as a singular human being, there's other human beings. They make up like one entity, you could say, in a certain sense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Thinking of humanity as a singular whole, right?
As a singular whole. And
or
there
even
are
the entire
other
planet.
Humanities. Yeah, there is other humanity somewhere else. So
mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, you touched on it a minute ago, and you started going into it a bit, and now I think we can probably dive in a bit more. One of the ways to start understanding this idea of, man has 7 principles in Theosophy is to start sort of from the bottom up. And, what I was thinking of is there's different ways that people understand what man is, and we can start from the most simplistic and go to the most complex. And that helps us kind of, there's like a bridge there between the simplistic and the complex. So for a newcomer, there's there's essentially, well, let's say the most simple version of what man is the materialistic scientific view, which is man is just a body. That's it. Just a physical body. Consciousness arises somehow.
Out of the brain. Well, and that's it. No problem. Investigate that. You know everything, quote unquote, about man. That's their perspective. Although
so
I
that's
must
the
say,
simplest.
it's slowly changing. That perspective. I think by the end of the century, we're going to have a completely different view of who we are.
Yeah, with more effort into a more like a more scientific exploration of consciousness is definitely going to open up all kinds of different avenues for that.
It's happening. The foot is in the door.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the next step then is basically the duad that you talked about before, which is body and soul. And you could think about that a couple different ways, because you could think, well, the division is body and soul. But like I said, if we go to the word soul and we go back to where we get the concept of soul from, we have that word psyche, right? So even science recognizes this body mind thing, right? There's a distinction in a certain sense between body and mind. The difference between the concept of mind and the concept of soul, I think, for the average person is essentially, does it continue after the body's dead or not? Was it here before the body was created or not? So usually when we talk about soul, we're talking about something more enduring. And when we talk about mind scientifically, it's still tied in with the birth and death of the body, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and within science, they make that distinction, of course, between mind and body, but from their materialistic perspective, it's still all material. Whereas I think in the general population, when you speak of soul, whether they're Christian or not, you're not really referring to something of that gross nature like science looks at it.
Mm-hmm.
So people do recognize that they have a mind and that it functions apparently independently from the body.
Yeah.
Well,
so that's the simplest sort of beyond just a body. That's the simplest idea, is that it's a body and a soul. And like you said, I think when the average person thinks of soul, they think of it in a vehicular aspect. Like that's kind of how, in theosophical terms, we would say when people talk about soul, they're talking about what we would refer to as the vehicle soul, meaning that it has some kind of form, so to speak. It's some kind of body, but not physical. It's like an entity that continues on after the body's dead. So there's that part of it. It's not just some abstract idea of mind or something, right?
Yeah, and that's the difficulty. But it was more in the forefront of the news in the I would say towards the end of the 1900s, with all these experiences and manifestations of NDEs. They're still happening, of course. Near death experience, NDE, or OBEs, out of body experience. And heaps of books have been written, and most of them, of course, more or less in a new age atmosphere. But notwithstanding, for those people, those experiences were real. People who were under surgery and they were coming out of their body, and I would say almost hitting the ceiling and looking down upon what was going on. And even they were able to explain what was going on, what the surgeons was doing, what the names were of the doctors and the nurses. And so they saw themselves lying there. So then the question is, okay, what is then soul and body? Because my body is there, so maybe I'm the soul. But that is also something objective. So yeah, then you have to bring in different planes of existence, and it becomes more and more complex then, of course. And I don't know how far we want to push that now, but I'm sure we'll get into more of those details later on in later podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. We can dive deep into some of that stuff in later ones. But the NDE thing is really important, I think, because it's one of the things that Blavatsky talks about in some of her writings, that we've got a lot of people talking about it over the last 150 years, is that one of the places that modern science currently doesn't quite hit the mark is that it can't account for some of those kinds of experiences. I mean, we can brush it away with like hallucination and stuff, but when there's conscious, yeah, right. So, and in general, I would say in general, in a scientific community, it does kind of get brushed away as well. It's probably something going on in the brain or whatever. But if you've had an outer body experience or you've had a near death experience, there's nothing from a scientist that's going to shake your feeling of the reality of it.
Yeah.
So then you have a lot of people who are like, it's real. Obviously, something is real.
Because for those people who experienced it, okay, you can say from a scientific perspective, well, maybe it was the drugs, maybe it was a dream, but then how could they come up with the knowledge that that experience contained, knowing things that they didn't know lying on the operation table?
Mm-hmm.
And science can't explain that. So, that's what they usually do. If they can't explain it, it sort of doesn't exist for the time being. But eventually they will be forced to look at it. And some scientists have looked at it, but then from the general scientific community, they also become sort of outliers. They're like, oh yeah, with all that psychic stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But there definitely are people exploring it. Okay, so we've got body and we've got soul. And soul, when we talk about it the way we just did, soul is kind of very abstract for people, right? When we talk about soul, it's not like we have very clear ideas of what we mean by it. And that led to the thing that was happening in, well, at least in earlier Christian times, where soul and spirit were being muddled up as the same thing. So then what distinction do we make between soul and spirit? Like what is the importance of that distinction and what does it mean? That takes us to the next step, right?
Yeah. Well, in Christianity, the usual perception of people is that we are a body and we have a soul, instead of saying we are the soul and we have a body. And of course, that leads then to all kinds of ideas like the ultimate resurrection of the physical body. Well, good luck with that. And that's why they don't want to be cremated while they are cremated in the coffin eventually, because they forget that a lot of heat is also produced in a decaying body, Mm-hmm. So I don't know how they want to resolve that, but I doubt very much that they'll be able to do that. And then the soul goes to heaven. Oh, then you have to say, well, I want to go to heaven, so it must be the soul. Whereas from a theosophical perspective, we make more distinctions, even in the term soul itself. There is a spiritual soul, there is a human soul, and there is an animal soul. But that doesn't mean that we're three parts. I mean, it's still one thing. What we then are, in particular, on our plane, is what we identify with. So those elements of soul represent certain functions, you could say, of that sevenfold constitution. So that sevenfold, we divide it in three: spirit, soul, and body. And what is soul? Well, soul is a vehicle of experience. Our experiences are recorded within those vehicles, whether it's spirit, human soul, or animal soul. And yeah, you can then, like I said, you can go further and look into the sevenfold constitution, where each one of those principles or vehicles has a particular function. But those three souls, so to speak, cover the whole range of our makeup.
Yeah, that's a really important one. So, when we talk about spirit, we can, in a certain sense, spirit is kind of the only principle that we don't look at as vehicular. We don't look at it as substantial in a sense. In a certain sense, spirit is kind of just an abstraction for whatever you want to call it, the source of consciousness is, something along those lines. And then, like you said, then we've got soul. And I'm glad you brought up the three parts of soul, because it's an easier way to go from spirit, soul, body. Once you kind of get that idea, to go from that to the sevenfold, the first thing you have to do is divide up soul. And Theosophy is not the only place to do that, right? The Greeks also did that. For them, Psyche or Psyche had three aspects that correspond to the three human ones as well. Of course, they
Yeah,
use Greek terms for them, but
the Muse of Plato, that's also a soul in a certain sense.
mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So you could say certain functions that we experience, whether that be purely physical, say, for instance, our instincts. Well, they belong the lower instinct, because you can refer to higher instincts too, but especially the lower instincts, they belong to the animal soul, more of a human instinct, and the capacity to use our ratio, our mind, thoughts, belongs to the human soul. And then those elements in us that belongs more to what you could call the ethical component, and higher intellect belongs to what you could call the spiritual soul. But the spiritual soul itself, not the spirit. You have to add a vehicle there. Therefore, if you use the Sanskrit terms, that you refer to Atma and Buddhi as one, which, by the way, is also the manifested monad. So there's alternative terms that can come into play as well.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that relates to the fact that in a certain sense, we are a complex being. And from the other hand, well, in different cultures, they have developed their own different terminologies for those different parts.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing in among Theosophists is we don't have to insist upon that people use the theosophical division, or the Theosophists are comfortable with all these Sanskrit terms and stuff, but you just used English terms for all the principles too: spiritual soul, human soul, animal soul. We can, in Sanskrit, Buddhi, manas, kama. We can start using these terms, but people don't have to. I mean, you can follow any system and you're going to find the same kind of ideas. It's more about understanding, like you said, we're a complex being. We're not a one-dimensional being. So then, okay, so we've covered, we all recognize there's a body. And then if we say there's a soul, so now we have soul body, then we have soul body spirit. And then we can take soul and we can divide it threefold. So now we have spirit above, body below, so to speak, and threefold soul. So now we're up to 5 principles of the 7. The only thing left to do then now is to divide up or to get more complex in how we view body. Because in Theosophy, there's a bit more of a complex view of body. Not just in Theosophy, but in a lot of Eastern systems have this very similar view of
The
the different
Buddhists,
makeup
the
of body.
Hindus, the Jains, they all have different systems, but they're all referring to the subjects of what we're discussing today. So all these cultures have their own peculiar way of looking at things. But then when you dive into each one of those cultures, really to what you could call an esoteric level, it seems at least that on an esoteric level, their perceptions are pretty much all standardized as the same. So
Exactly.
it's only
So
due to the influence of what you could call religion and priesthood that those things became diversified, so to speak.
yeah, exactly. And different cultures use different languages, so we have different words, and there's Hebrew words, there's Greek words, there's Sanskrit, there's Tibetan and Chinese, and
Latin, well,
for the
you name
same
it.
things, right? They're talking about the same idea. So one of those ideas that is common across pretty much every Eastern tradition, though they use different terminology for it, is the idea that there's not just a physical body, there's also what we call in Theosophy an astral body. So that's our first point of dividing the lower part of the body, quote unquote, body part of the spirit, soul, body triad. We can divide that up. And the first idea for there is there's not just physical, there's astral. So, and that word astral is very common in New Age these days, but maybe not always with an idea of where that word came from and what it means. So can you
Yeah,
clarify
exactly.
a little bit for us on astral body? What do we mean there?
Well, yeah, astral is also a very broad spectrum, because from a certain perspective, at least from a theosophical perspective, it is said that there are 7 degrees of astrality, you could say. They are then in turn again subdivided, like the 3 higher astral are sometimes referred to as Akasha, or sometimes even Alaya. which also relates to soul, by the way. And then the three lower ones are different degrees of astral substances. And then the bottom one is, of course, the physical body. So astral is, at least with regard to what we generally refer to as the astral body, you could call that the blueprint, like that of an architect, of our physical body, that is the physical house, so to speak. But that blueprint in itself has also subdivisions. So there is a blueprint in there that represents the idea of how the body will function, what shape it will have, what density it will have. So that astral body is a lot more subtle, you could say. But like I said, that has also subdivisions, because there is one aspect of the astral body that always stays with the physical. But you know that people speak, for instance, of going out of the body, astral travel. Well, that's obviously not with that aspect that always stays with the physical body, because when you die, that goes into the coffin or goes away, when people get cremated. So you see there the different functionalities that come into play. And so that each one of those principles has also different layers, you could say. But generally speaking, we look at the astral body as the underlying blueprint of the physical body. And in its lowest aspect, it is actually the physical body, you could say, because that's our real body, even though we can't see it. When we look at each other, we're actually looking at each other's astral body, but we do not see it, because what comes to us on this plane is only a certain outline that we identify as a physical body, but it also has organs and so forth. But then there are subtler layers of that astral body where a lot of those functionalities drop away. For instance, Mr. Crosby, one of the students of the United Lodge of Theosophists, in one of his answers, he refers to the idea that you can also, pretty much for every one of the principles, subdivide them into elements, like fire, air, water, earth. And he says the earth aspect of that of the astral body stays with the physical body. The water aspect is what continues after death for a while. Then there is the air aspect and the fire aspect, which relates more to our higher principles, but still with an astral substance to it. And that is what takes us then later into a state that is referred to as devachan, sort of corresponding to the Christian heaven, so to speak. But then you see the complexities there of all once you start diving into it. And we'll get into that deeper later on.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's really great. There's a couple of things that you touched on there that I think is good. One is we can call back to the NDE and OBE experiences, because there's different types of them. And like you said, there's, in New Age stuff, we have the idea of astral travel. But people who have outer body experiences have different types of outer body experience. And in Theosophy, we would say, well, in some of those cases, it's because it's a different layer, like you said, of the astral that is being operated through. So the one that you said always stays with the physical body, sometimes people have outer body experiences where it's like they move away from the physical body, but there's a limit, a very close limit, like only a few feet or a few meters. And then there's kind of like almost like a pull or a crack or a sound, and you get pulled back into
like
the physical body.
Explosion, really. Like an explosion.
And then there's other outer body experiences or near-death experiences where seemingly you can go almost to an infinite distance. I mean, you can go, there's this feeling of being in a body that's very subtle and can move like a cloud, like up and move to different places, still within the physical world, because you can go to a place in the physical world, which is a really odd experience. So obviously Theosophy has a certain explanation of that. Other systems have different explanations. There's some overlap in the explanations, but that illustrates that there's something more than just a singular kind of astral astral body.
Think of that dream experience when you're flying. You have a dream where you're really flying around. Now, okay, you can designate that as a dream because anything that happens in sleep can be designated, generally speaking, as a dream. But it may very well be that that is also an aspect of that astral body. And, there's alternative terms for it, like the Mayavi Rupa, for instance,
Illusion
or
body.
Chayas, and so forth and so forth. That, for instance, the experience of a flying dream could be that you move out of the body on a different level into that particular vehicle, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And also keep in mind that all near-death experiences are associated with an OBE as well, an out-of-body experience, but not necessarily the reverse. Not all OBEs is a death experience, of course. It's not a near-death experience.
Exactly. Yeah. The other part that you talked about that I thought it's one of the things in Theosophy that we talk about a lot when we talk about the astral is the idea of it being a blueprint. And I thought that's actually another spot we tied in the spirit, soul, body idea to a verse in the Bible from Paul where he makes that distinction. We can also do this a little bit with the idea that there's an astral body that's a blueprint of a physical body, where in Genesis it speaks of the coat of skin. The idea of that man is created. So first man is created, and then he's given a coat of skin. So it's like there's already a vehicle there, so to speak. That's what we'd refer to as an astral body. And then the coat of skin is just kind of that outer layer, so to speak, outer layer that is around and on top of the astral body.
Yeah. And we are that astral body, and that coat of skin is what we're seeing of each other. But we're actually looking at astral bodies, but we don't see them.
Yeah, exactly. Because our eyes are organs that are designed.
Yeah, that has purely to do with our physical objective senses that we use to look outside or hear or feel or taste or smell or whatever. No.
Yeah, exactly. One of the ways that
there's one thing that's kind of important to mention, that when we speak of a blueprint here, we're not talking about a static something like the plan of an architect. There is a correspondence with it, but it's a dynamic blueprint. It's alive. But it's not like something printed on a piece of paper or so. So it has its reality on its own plane. So we shouldn't make a mistake to look upon it as, static or passive.
Yeah, it's funny because you get this image of like, well, God is there and he draws a picture of man and then he creates man. That's the blueprint, but that's not what we're talking about. Right. So one of the ways that I think is helpful with that is in Theosophy, you'll often, or at least from like, in conversations with Theosophists, you'll hear people talk about the astral body as like electromagnetic or something along those kinds of lines. That's where we can kind of connect it in with science a little bit, perhaps. So one of the ideas is that, the astral body is more electric or magnetic in nature. And then the physical body, which we say the physical molecules, are attracted to and attached to that magnetic blueprint, so to speak. So I always think of like in very coarse terms of like a magnet and iron filings are going to attract and cover the magnet. And that's one way to start thinking about the physical body as a coat over top of the astral, so to speak. I say over top, not like it's actually on the outside. It's all the molecules.
Yeah.
You'd have to imagine
that's
that
an important distinction that we need to make. It's not that the astral body, in a certain sense, is around us and there's a physical body in there, or a physical body in which an astral body is to be found somewhere. Every cell, every molecule of our body is at the same time also that astral body. So they are, to use a strange word, it's not very often used anymore nowadays, that word coadunition. It's not consubstantial. It's not of the same substance, but it is in coadunition. So it exists in the same place, and that's possible for the simple reason that it is a much ethereal substance. And you can call that an electromagnetic substance, if you like, How, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to find terminology. I mean, we can, like I said, we can use that kind of terminology because it kind of gives us a bridge from a scientific mindset to what we're talking about in Theosophy, but without nailing it down too much. But when people have out of body experiences, one of the things that's common is that, let's say your physical body's lying in bed, is that the astral body like comes out of the physical body. So it's like in normal condition, they're the same space. It's like two bodies interlocked together, but they're separable. And that's the thing that Theosophy says, that they are separable in that way. And so an outer body experience would be that case where they separate out. There's actually like a really good Marvel movie that shows that, Doctor Strange, where they talk about the astral body, and they show this idea. At one point he's in the hospital lying down on a bed. He's been stabbed, and his astral body sits up. His body's lying there, and his astral body sits up. And that's actually like fairly accurate to how a theosophist would talk about it. That there's a separation that can occur, and the astral, the most coarse or like lowest version of the astral, would still feel like it has arms, legs, head, shape of the physical body, right?
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze, Demi Moore. I think that's probably, in terms of an objective projection of it, as close as we can come to the idea. Except that, of course, you can see the astral body, but yeah, they had to give it some form so that you could see something in the movie, of course. But you see him walking through doors and stuff like that. So also because the dynamics and the signs, you could say, on that level is entirely different than on our plane.
Right. Okay, so counting our principles out then. Let's go from top down now. So we've got spirit at the top. We've got soul in three distinctions, not separate things, but three souls, three aspects of soul. And then we've got astral body, physical body. So that's six. The seventh principle, which when we count from the top down, is the fifth from the bottom. If we count from the bottom up, we go body, astral body, and then we count this other principle, which is a kind of a fascinating one because it's not, it's physical in a sense, but it's not vehicular or bodily the way we normally think of it.
Substantial, but not material. If you want to make a distinction between the two words, and that's kind of interesting too, because the word substance, it doesn't matter on what level you apply it. There is like submarine, under, below. It is that which carries actually the consciousness layered on top, so to speak. Of course, in reality, the two are one in coordination. But metaphorically, that's a way of looking at it, that the vehicle, or even you can use the word container if you like, that the container carries the consciousness. But they're very much intertwined, of course. And yeah, you can use that for every principle.
So the last principle we haven't talked about then is, in theosophical terms, we use Sanskrit terms for it, and we'd call it prana or prana jiva. In English terms, we could use something like life energy or vital force, or there's a bunch of different terms we can use for that. So can you touch on prana jiva a little bit? It's a bit of a unique principle in a certain sense.
Yeah. So prana, if you literally translate it, it would mean energy. There's also the word jiva. Jiva is usually used for the cosmic aspects of everything that exists. There is a dynamic energy everywhere, whether you call them electromagnetic fields or not. And that's even, you could say, the coarsest representation of it, or like gravitational force. So, and Mr. Judge, for instance, he makes the distinction that when that energy operates through a vehicle or in a container, we refer to it as prana. As long as it does not occupy a container on the outside, so to speak, then we refer to it as jiva. But it's also of a cosmic nature, and that's a little bit the difficulty when we apply that to our sevenfold constitution. HPB says our three higher principles are jivic. The four lower principles are pranic. So, of course, there is prana circulating through the body. You have your blood circulation. You have your nervous system operating, all of your thinking. All of that is related to different types of prana, very well known and recognized in, for instance, Ayurveda, the Indian medical approach, for instance. But so when you sum them up, you're going to refer to it as a distinct principle. There is prana, but it is everywhere. It functions in the physical body, in the astral. It functions even in our desires. I mean, our desires are very dynamic. So anytime you're confronted with anything of a dynamic element, prana is involved. And they have even many different names for it in Sanskrit books. So there is
Exactly.
different functions for prana, you could say, just like there are different functions for the astral body. And usually, from a principle perspective, we have at the bottom the physical body. The next one up is usually referred to as astral body, and then prana. But sometimes those two are also interchanged because, yeah, you can really, with respect to the lower aspects of prana, you can separate it from the astral body.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and that must then also, like you pointed out earlier, have a substantial element to it because otherwise it wouldn't exist, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that's so interesting about the prana as a principle, or the life principle, is that it is in operation everywhere. And it's something really foreign to Western thinking, but it's, like you pointed out, it's very common in Eastern thinking. So you brought up Ayurveda. That's a really good tie into the approach to prana. In Eastern Asian systems, we'd call it chi or ji, and there's tons of stuff talked about there. It plays a major role in Chinese medicine, just as prana does in Ayurvedic medicine. So in the East, there's always been a big discussion of and practice related to life energy as its own distinct thing. It's not the electrical impulses of the nervous system per se. It's not the blood per se. It's like the enlivening or vital force or energy
Vital,
in
that's a good word
those
for it.
systems.
Vital aspect, the living aspect or dynamic aspect of something, always involved with prana, but
Mm-hmm.
different aspects of that. Prana is just a principle and then has different functions. Depending on what aspect it functions in, we give it a different name, of course, just like scientists do with respect to the physical body too. So they shouldn't complain to us that we make those distinctions.
Exactly. One of the things that we find in modern science is there's an exploration of origin, and there's an exploration of consciousness. And typically, when they're talking about exploration of origin, when it comes to human beings or life on Earth, the phrasing is origin of life. Okay, so what scientists are looking for is the origin of life. So in Theosophy, we'd make all kinds of distinctions there to say, well, life is one thing, consciousness is another thing, substance is another thing. They don't all originate in the same way in the in a world or in a system. So
In their
you could say
expression.
that
No.
in the expression, they all come from the same source, so to
Yeah.
speak. Like you
Yeah.
brought up the
They are
oneness at
one.
the
In
beginning.
fact, yeah, they are one. Yeah.
Exactly. But when we
That's
talk
a better
about
idea.
life,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I
No,
was just
go
gonna say,
ahead.
when we talk about life, we one of the things we make a distinction of scientifically is, in theosophical terms, we could say the distinction between the mineral kingdom and the plant kingdom, let's say. In science, we talk about it a little bit differently, but we would say a rock doesn't have life, but a tree does. And that's sort of the pranic aspect. It's like prana is functioning in a certain way that
Yeah.
allows organic, what we call organic form to arise, right?
Exactly. That's the word. That distinction that is made in science, and I think they already are developing different perspectives at it, is that we call organic that which moves. If it moves, it's organic. But what is that moving? Well, that's the life force, prana. And it's something that is not immediately obvious in a rock. It just sits there. But the rock has the capacity to respond to external input, because when it gets hot, the rock expands. When it gets cold, the rock shrinks. So over time, the rock responds to its environment and starts falling apart, dying, you could say, to eventually end up as sand on the beach, as a matter of speech. So, strictly speaking, when you then dive into the mineral kingdom, it's not so static. It's actually very dynamic. We know that that the rock is made up of atoms and subatoms. It's not sitting still. We just do not perceive the motion. In fact, the motion is so fast that we see it as solid. You know, like where you take a flashlight, put it on a cord, and turn it around very slow. You can follow it. But as you speed it up, at some point you just see a circle. That's how we look at a rock. It's actually almost more alive than ourselves, we could say. So, but on the external perspective or perception of it, it seems as if it's just sitting still, of course, but it's expanding and shrinking. It's alive because it moves. And that's basically a very good definition also. What is consciousness? Well, if it moves, it's conscious. It's the capacity or ability to move. Where does that come from? From spirit. And then you have to start defining that, of course.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Also think of our desires, our feelings, our passions, all driven by prana. It's everywhere. But as a principle, with respect especially to the lower principles, it's usually in the second or the third place up from the bottom. It depends on the context.
I always thought that the way the Force is represented in Star Wars is a good bridge for people towards the idea of prana or chi.
That's more of a jivic force than may the force be with you. That's a cosmic force. That's jiva.
It's everywhere. It's between everything. It's in everything. And
which is the dynamic energy actually of the spiritual soul, we could say. That's why they call upon it. May the force be with you. May the spiritual soul be with you. That's one way of looking at it, at least.
So one thing that we've touched on in a couple places here about the principles is that in theosophical literature, what you'll find is the principles listed, and you'll hear already in our conversation, you'll hear us talking about, the principles from top down or from bottom up or in order. And so when we list the principles in Theosophy, we have 7 principles and we list them from top down, so to speak. And there's a few ways to look at that, but one of the ways is to say, okay, well, the bottom is the most coarse, physical, dense, so to speak, up to the more upward is a direction of more and more ethereal.
Yeah.
So the other way to think about it is that what we point to at the top, when we say spirit at the top, in theosophical terms, we'd use the Sanskrit word Atma, and we wouldn't necessarily always say spirit. Sometimes we say self. But when we talk about that which is at the very top, it's also like the apex or the foundation or the beginning or the origin. So it's not like all principles are equal, so to speak. There's a direction, and in Theosophy we have this emanation idea. It's very similar to what the Gnostics have, right? So you have this spirit. Everything comes out of spirit, so to speak. So everything is in some way a manifestation of spirit.
All the principles come out of spirit, and then you have to define spirit.
Yeah, exactly. Which is the really hard part. And that's why I wanted to bring up that word self as well, because most often you'll hear the word Atma listed as self. And in theosophical terms, the highest principle, we call it Atma. Self, spirit are in some ways kind of interchangeable, but also not. They're distinct ideas as well, right? So how do we define that which all the principles come from? Like that, because the question of what we are comes to that kind of essence. Like, what are we? If you were to strip away the physical body, the astral body, get rid of the life, so there's no prana, there's no bodies that it's operating through on the lower level, you could shut down the desire nature, you could shut down the mental thinking nature. All of these things could be eliminated, so to speak, or paused or paralyzed without the being not existing anymore. So what is it that always exists, is always present, is that highest point? So how do we define that properly?
Yeah. Yeah, that's also a question of, again, how you look at it. You could say, and even scientists have to admit that, although they usually see it more as an abstraction, that as long as it doesn't manifest, it doesn't exist. And that is the word potentiality. Say you have a battery and you turn it off. We talk about potential energy in there, right? But that potential, especially with respect to spirit, is a reality on its own plane. Whereas for a scientist, that's more like an abstraction. Well, yeah, there's no current flowing. So when I turn on the switch, the current flows. Well, where did it come from otherwise than from that potentiality? So the potentiality means that there is something that has within it the power to manifest, but is itself unmanifested. Now, unmanifested doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It is not, it's not nothing. It's, that famous expression used also by Buddhists, no thing. It's not nothing, but it's no thing. And that is a reality on its own plane. And that even has what you can almost call a kind of entitative character. That also depends on how you look at it. Referred to as Purusha. And what is Purusha? That's that highest principle or Atma. Is translated as man, Purusha, man. Also has other possible meanings. And that is the problem with everything, because that potentiality, you can call it Atma, in combination with Buddhi, which is a more substantial vehicle of that spirit. Those two are not even in reality distinct. They are one. And then we call it the monad, the manifested monad, not the monad per se, which is Atma. And that is infinite potentiality. But that is from our perspective, because we don't know or can see what it is. If you would be with your consciousness on that plane of that principle, it would have an entitative reality, by lack of better words again. And how else do you want to call it? If we were to refer to something as a self in us, where is it? How are you going to grasp that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, because it's of a totally different nature than what we can even imagine. It's everywhere at the same time, you could say.
Yeah.
Because potentiality is everywhere, right? It's everywhere in the world, in the cosmos, full of potentiality. And then you fill out what kind of type of manifestation it will have, but everything comes from potentiality. But again, that's the way we look at it. A yogi will call it not potentiality, they call it something different, like spirit or whatever.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, because we it was one thing in Theosophy, and any given system has the same thing. We're always talking about whatever we're talking about from our perspective, and our perspective is limited. So there's only so much we can say about that. And if you go to different systems around the world, they'll have different ways of talking about spirit. And often, if you go to Buddhism, for instance, especially if you go to Northern Buddhism, and the way that they talk about, the highest aspects that we can talk about in terms of man, they usually talk about things like luminosity, like luminousness, like something to do with light, something to do with, like, there's this idea of our essential nature in some way is like a luminous entity, right? Which all the vehicles that we operate through, all the bodies and the soul and everything, are distinct from that luminous being itself. Whatever that is per se is something like light, so to speak. or
And
that's the best we can imagine.
Yeah. And you're already referring there to substance in prana as well, energy, light. It has to be substantial or it wouldn't exist. Well, it's dynamic, it radiates energy. So where does it come from then? Well, from pure, you could say pure consciousness per se, not the way that it expresses itself through one of the vehicles, just in and of itself, a no thing to us.
To us, exactly. Okay, so we have this idea of spirit, and it's really difficult to talk about because it is so abstract to us. And then we could start kind of marching our way down the constitution, so to speak. So, what's the first veil that that spirit puts on, so to speak? What's the first in theosophical terms? You could also say, like, what's the first robe that that spirit puts on? So that spirit you brought up a minute ago is inseparable from what we view as its first or primary vehicle, which we call, with by the Sanskrit term, Buddhi, 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 the same kind of root as the word Buddha comes from. So Atma, spirit or self, and Buddhi, spiritual soul, is the primary pairing or primary duad, right? So how do we imagine those two as one? You brought up the word monad, so can you go into that just a bit?
Well, the monad per se is what we refer to then as that infinite potentiality. It's inexhaustible. And that can be applied to everything, like HPV. Blavatsky says in The Secret Doctrine, it's on page 21 at the bottom, where she says, the term monad can be applied from an atom to a solar system. But that is for the simple reason that that potentiality to manifest is everywhere. It is also, it's not intelligence itself, but it is the potentiality to be intelligent. So where does the intelligence then resides? Well, actually, and oddly enough, in the substantial counterpart of it, its vehicle. And that's also where, when words are used like archetypes, where are the archetypes? Well, they are in that Buddhi. And that Buddhi, Blavatsky points that out, Atma without Buddhi, that potentiality without a vehicle, that vehicle, she says, is just pure Prakriti, undifferentiated substance. It's everywhere. Yeah? And then, well, you do not have a, what you could call an individualized being yet. So it's universal, both Atma, that potentiality, and its vehicle, homogeneous substance or Prakriti, whatever you want to call it, is universal. The whole cosmos consists of that. But it has in itself the potentiality to appear individualized. Think about that.
Right.
Very close
It's an
also
appearance
to
of
the
it.
idea in quantum physics, the field and the particle. I wouldn't say exactly the same, but at least they run parallel from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, it's a very similar concept if you sort of take it to its most abstract level, the idea of fields. I think most likely for science to approach the idea that we're trying to talk about when we talk about Buddhi is probably through the exploration of what field means. Because we're getting further in our understanding of field to the point of almost non-substantiality. Right. And that's sort of the verging point of Atma and Buddhi, or that connection between Atma and Buddhi, so to speak, is that point of almost non-material, non-substantial. Buddhi, in its highest aspect, is as non-substantial as we can possibly imagine something to be. Right.
Yeah. A common mistake that is made in associating those philosophical ideas with quantum physics is by thinking, oh, the field is spirit and the particle is body. If you just use the twofold combination. No. That field is substantial. So it's actually closer to the idea of Buddhi rather than to spirit. Spirit is the capacity of to have something going on in the field. That would be spirit. The field itself is already substantial, no matter how ethereal it may be. And by the way, when we use the word ethereal, scientists shouldn't complain. Eh? Have you ever seen your Wi-Fi flying through your window? I don't see it. Do you see gravity? I don't see it. Before people knew that there was gravity, and you would say there is an invisible force that attracts us to the earth, you go like, oh, please put him on the stake, burn the guy. He's totally crazy. So you see how things evolve, and HVB makes a, what's it called again? The God idea, she says, evolves pari passu with the development of our own mental brain and concepts, etc., etc. So we see that historically we're starting to move away from that guy with the beard on a cloud, which is absolutely, you could say almost from that perspective, those Christians who believe it that way, it's pure materialism.
It's a material God in that kind of, and it's sort of a caricature
with all the
now.
bad stuff that we have. He gets angry, revengeful, yada yada.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas Atma is no such thing as that. It's just a potentiality, even to be angry in its essence. But it's not Atma that is angry. It's the potentiality to apply that, because that spirit contains all potentiality of everything.
Yeah. And anything that like anger is an interesting one, because, or any emotion or any thought or anything, it's all potentiality within, so to speak, that Atma, but it needs an appropriate vehicle to manifest through. It needs a vehicle that's complex in a certain way, that's structured in a certain way, that allows for the expression of self-consciousness or thought or emotion or so on. So let's step down to the next step then. We've got the Atma Buddhi pairing, and that we can call the manifested monad. It's actually a duad, a monad and a duad at the same time, depending on our point of view. Yeah.
To make it easy, she just call it monad. Monad.
Yeah. And then, so let's step down one more. The next principle we add in there is in Sanskrit terms, we use the word manas, which translates in English to mind. So now we have spirit, Atma. We have spiritual soul, Buddhi, which we can attach other terms to, like understanding. You attach intelligence, wisdom, those kind of terms. And then we've got mind. So what happens to the Atma Buddhi when mind is added to the equation?
Yeah, that's a rather complex issue, of course, because you could say in a certain sense, mind exists everything. There is something to say for that idea, like in Buddhism, the mind-only school. But in Theosophy, it's not used like that school uses it. But mind is in a certain sense everywhere, because it is the intelligent aspect of Buddhi. And so there is something, and it's not always entirely clear, because since mind isn't on a cosmic level, there is such a thing as a cosmic mind, cosmic intelligence. And I find that kind of interesting. That I just want to throw that in there, that scientists are investigating nature, but they can't really nail it down. There's always progress in their understanding. So who's more intelligent? The one you're investigating, or the one who's investigating? Right? And then you're going to tell me that there's no cosmic mind? Of course, don't materialize that. It's of a nature that is at present for us in our present condition incomprehensible. And that is represented by those hierarchies that you were referring to at the very beginning. And so it becomes complex to explain it like in 5 minutes, but you could say the gist of it is that there is an entitative character to those two universal principles. And they are, you could say, in a certain sense, they have an entitative character. But that entitative character only becomes really objective when it emanates itself on a lower plane. And that's what we refer to then as the manifestation of mind. It's very hard to explain because those those beings, in a certain sense, that you can call them beings or entities, referred to in with Sanskrit names and Buddhist names, Dhyan Chohans, Dhyani Buddhas, Manasaputras, and so forth, which have their equivalents also in Greek and Roman terminologies. Angel, for instance, messenger. That's what the word angel means. They use it in the church. They have messengers. Those are actually Dhyan Chohans. Those are human beings that have transcended the limitations of their manifested existence. That manifested existence on different planes of density, so to speak. But they're all in coordination. So those beings are referred to as Atma Buddhis or monads. Then you wonder, okay, but where is the mind then? Well, in their evolution from coming through the human stage into their, if you like, angelic stage or monadic stage, their mental external vehicle has been absorbed within the body. So you can't make a distinction anymore between Buddhi and manas there. They're just referred to as duas. When the manas is still external, then they're referred to as triads. And so on an objective plane, you could say an objectified human being is such a representation or an emanation of those triads. We have mind, but our mind is not permanently associated and connected with that Buddhi, wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit of a complex explanation, but there's just no other way than explaining.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing, the exploration of mind is not something you're going to be able to sum up in 2 minutes. And in a future podcast, we can probably have an entire podcast devoted to the idea of mind and how we see it in Theosophy and how we explore it. But the one of the themes that you keep bringing up that we talk about a lot with this is the idea of potentiality and the manifestation of that potentiality. So when we talk about mind, it's no different. There's mind per se as a potentiality, like you expressed, and there's the way that mind can be expressed. And then in very simple terms, Theosophy would view mind as being expressed in all kinds of different gradations. Often I think in just popular culture and stuff, when we talk about mind, we're usually thinking about this mind, like the way that a self-conscious human mind operates. And so that's what we think of as mind, but we have to really like get beyond that idea when we're talking about the principle of mind in Theosophy, right? The way that mind is manifesting through a human being right now is only one way that mind can manifest. It's only one expression of that. Mind also manifests in animals in a different way. It expresses,
in
like you say,
everything.
in everything. Everything has mind in some way that
Yeah.
is
But
being
that
expressed.
doesn't mean it has self-consciousness. Huh? Like
Exactly.
mind operates as intelligence in the lower kingdoms, but it's not aware of itself. Whereas it's only in the human kingdom that we have become aware of ourselves. What the underlying process is that's something for later, because that's also far out, you could say. But the mistake should not be made by thinking that when we say a cosmic mind, that we're talking about some guy up there who is that cosmic mind. That cosmic mind is represented by an innumerable amount. I mean, when we look at the whole cosmos, an innumerable amount of hierarchies that are the vehicle for the expression of that mind. And then, so from a cosmic perspective, the spiritual soul and the cosmic mind is one thing. You can't have there is spiritual soul and here is cosmic mind. It's one thing. It's the intelligent aspect of that spiritual soul. And in the cosmos, it's referred to as Maha-Buddhi. In us as Buddhi, in the cosmos as Maha-Buddhi. But in the cosmos, you can't separate those two. They're one thing. In us, they're not separate, but they're distinct in the sense that each of those three higher principles, higher manas, Buddhi, and Atma, will be developed in the future consecutively over a very long period of time, several billions of years, unless you follow a specific training to accelerate that process, which you're not going to find in New Age.
Exactly. So this is a good way to go here. Yeah. Yeah. This is a good way to go. So we've got Atma, spirit, Buddhi, spiritual soul, manas or mind, also human soul. We can use that terminology in the same way. And then we talked earlier about three divisions of soul. That was spiritual soul, Buddhi, human soul, manas, and animal soul, kama. So how do we imagine the picture once there's a fourth principle in how we're understanding it? Once the kamic or animal soul is brought into the picture.
Yeah. Well, it goes without saying that we all know that we have emotions. We can get angry, we can fall in love, you name it. A gazillion types of different expressions of desire of wanting something, which, by the way, is an energy. So also connected with prana, of course.
Mm-hmm.
It's also connected with the astral body because how else would that be able to express itself? So you could say it is a kind of lower form of motion. It's in connection with prana. It expresses our desires and feelings. And its tendency is to, you could say, it has a tendency to materialize itself. And so it can connect itself also, and is connected in its aspects with mind. So our mind, when we refer to the human soul, is actually dual. There is a higher and a lower mind. And that lower mind is connected to that aspect of desire. Sometimes it is said that lower desire is the inverse of Buddhi, because that Buddhi is not only wisdom, but it's also universal love and compassion. When that is reflected in the lower vehicles, in the animal soul, so to speak, then we refer to it as kama. Per se, it's not good or bad. It depends on how we direct it. When you have the desire to do something, there is this moment where we can decide to do it or not. There's a motive behind there. Can we control that motive? So you could almost say it's also at the same time animal instinct, if you like. Whereas the higher desire, the Buddhi, is a spiritual instinct, if you want to use even that word. They're just terms. You just need to use them in the proper context. That's like the word intuition and instinct. Well, intuition is spiritual instinct. Instinct is animal intuition. You have to play with those words. Once we start nailing down those words, like in Western philosophy, intuition means specifically that, you're lost. You're a goner. You know? Don't nail it down. Use every word in context, or you're going to get lost in your study of the Secret Doctrine too, of HPB's book. You have to use context.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what context is. It makes connections with things. Unity.
That's great, because when we talk about the three parts or divisions of soul like that, then we can imagine now a higher, a middle, and a bottom, so to speak. It's all one soul, right? Because it's
one
all
soul. Yeah.
It's all one soul.
Being.
But then we can say, yeah, exactly. And so the phrasing you used, I thought, we can think of spiritual soul, human soul, animal soul, one soul, and the other way to think of it is that it's just an unfolding of the same thing. So you've got the spiritual soul further unfolded human soul, further unfolded animal soul, but it's just manifestations of itself, so to speak, right? In different conditions with different functions and so on. Yeah. Okay, so then the next thing then is, so we've got the top 4 principles now so far: spirit, spiritual soul, human soul, animal soul. We can use the Sanskrit terms all we want, but we've got those 4. Then there's the pranic principle, which this is what brings us to the forefront now. Is when we're trying to wrap our heads around the principles, we'll start at the top and work our way down in the idea that one principle is emanating the next principle, so to speak. And that's true from one point of view. But also, like you just brought up, prana is there from the beginning. How could it not be? Because
Jiva. Yeah.
the soul is substantial, which means it's energetic, it's vital, which means that it's moving and there's energy, and so prana is enlivened, right? So then we have the prana jiva divide, sort of the higher version of life energy, and the lower, or the cosmic and the microcosmic. But we can just bring the pranic principle in and say, well, it's an expression of spirit through substance that enlivens that substance. So it's always there. Yeah.
Yeah. It's sometimes that example is given like, think of yourself as a personal God, and you want to manifest a world, a globe, the earth. You're going to build the earth. What are the fundamental 3 principles that you need there? That's the power to move, consciousness. That is the power to be moved, that's substance, and something that connects the 2, energy. So the 3 fundamental principles to build anything. I gave that stupid example of a personal God or something, but you need fundamentally 3 principles always to produce something: consciousness, energy, and matter. And matter is actually a word that we usually use for the more denser aspects of substance. So you could say substance because it carries through that energy the spirit. So those are the 3 conditions to build anything. And in essence, they are one. That is then the monad per se. When that manifests as a matter of speech, then it acquires distinct functions, you could say, and still at all times they remain one. But in their expressions, sometimes it looks more like the one or the other, so to speak, depending on your capacity of perception. And ultimately, those 3 principles, if you combine them in the proper order, you end up with 7 fundamental principles.
Mm-hmm.
So on our plane, if you would take any one of those principles away, the whole thing would collapse. HVB mentions that in the Secret Doctrine, where she gives that table of those distinctions between the 7 principles, the koshas of the Vedantins, and the upadhis of the Taraka Raja Yoga. She says the adepts, from a practical perspective, prefer to use upadhis because those 3 can be separated, and the Atma can work individually or distinctly through one of those vehicles. But if you take the 7, she says, then we use that more from a theoretical perspective because they cannot really be separated. Why not? Because prana is not here at number 2 or 3, only as a designation of a list. See? Because it's everywhere. The astral is everywhere. Even the substance of our physical body is, in a sense, everywhere on more subtle levels as well. It exists as an archetype within the Buddhi. So everything is everywhere. Everything, everywhere, all the time. There's a movie like
Yeah, exactly. I was just thinking the same phrase. It's perfect. Well, it's a really good way to talk about it, because when one of the perspectives we take in Theosophy is kind of how we've been talking about it the last half an hour or so, is like an emanational process. There's something high, so to speak. There's something very subtle, and it emanates something a little less subtle. And then it emanates something a little less subtle. And there's a truth to that idea. And then we have this list of principles from top down. But like you said, the principles have to all be there at all times. So when we're talking about the principles in order, it's just to get our minds around what the principles are. But in practice, they're all present. So we've got all these principles now and we've got the spirit and the three aspects of soul, and then we've got prana that we've discussed, and then astral body, physical body, which provide vehicles for the operation of those principles. And I like you've brought up before that there's a phrase that HPB uses that in order for self-consciousness to manifest, it needs a sufficiently complex vehicle. So it's not like self-consciousness can manifest in the leaf of a tree.
Especially right? To manifest self-consciously, the vehicle needs to be extremely complex. And in us, that's our brain. You can make a fish self-conscious, not even a dog.
That's where it ties into physical material science a lot better, is when we start talking about that, we can say, okay, well, there is such a thing as organisms that don't have a centralized nervous system. They have a nervous system, but it's not centralized. And consciousness operates through there, but not self-consciousness. And then you have entities that have centralized nervous systems, and that's where self-consciousness can start to arise, and self-identification and ego, and all, not ego in the pejorative sense, but ego in terms of an I, a sense of me, can start to manifest. So physical evolution has to carry on for an amount of time for there to be a vehicle that is complex enough, a brain stem, a nervous system complex enough for the beginning of self-consciousness to arise. And from a theosophical perspective, human beings now are not far past that beginning. It's not like this is the highest version of self-consciousness. It's like the infant stage of self-consciousness.
Yeah, we're at a very early stage, only about 18 million years according to Theosophy. We're in the self-conscious state, and that not even all beings. But yeah, it is those, we have to think it like that way. There is only one consciousness, universal consciousness, and that has a tendency to manifest and individualize itself. When that individualizes itself, it has to go through different layers of substance, which is usually referred to as different planes, but they're all also in coordination. Now, in order for that consciousness, that potentiality of consciousness, in other words, the capacity to move, in order to get that down to the coarsest level, there's a problem there. As it descends deeper and deeper, although there's only one consciousness, as it descends deeper and deeper, it becomes more and more limited in its expression due to the coarseness of the vehicle. Don't mistake that as the same as the complexity. Those are two different things. You can have something very complex on a very subtle level. So all these levels have their own complexity, but they become denser and denser and denser. So from that perspective, you could say there's no such thing as states of consciousness. They're actually states of substance. But, we just refer to states of consciousness because on each of these planes, we see that one indivisible consciousness manifesting with certain characteristics. But that's only what the vehicle allows through, so to speak, to manifest. And then we give it the designation as this type of consciousness, this type of consciousness. But it's ultimately one. And at some point, it reaches a level where it becomes self-aware in a vehicle. It's always that infinite consciousness is also self-aware, but it's not our awareness. It's universal self-awareness. And that is beyond our pay grade. I mean, you'll find those ideas represented like in Hinduism, Vedanta, in even in Buddhism, and they all have their own different branches and ways of looking at things. Don't think of those schools as just one thing.
Yeah, for sure. Within them is all kinds of different points of view of it, but they all have, like you said, they all have versions of an idea of higher states of consciousness and lower states of consciousness, so to speak, or more subtle, more coarse states of consciousness, and so on. You brought up, so in bringing up states of consciousness, you also brought up something that we tie into Theosophy fairly commonly, and that's the Upadhi system of the yoga schools. And they there's a direct connection and correspondence we can make between those vehicles and the theosophical principles. In overview, in the yoga system, you have the idea that there's Atma, that's spirit or self, and then you've got three distinct upadhis. That's the Sanskrit word for vehicle. Then, right?
Call them souls if you like it.
Yeah, exactly. Soul. And the idea is that the self, per se, the Atma, operates independently, so to speak, through those different vehicles. And then there's a connection we can make between that and the states of consciousness that we routinely experience, which is waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and then a fourth state that they talk about, which would correspond to that spirit itself. But if you just take the three states, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and you correspond them to these three vehicles, the idea is that we can operate independently through those vehicles. And on the lower course level, we see that in terms of our normal nightly sleep pattern. The physical body goes to sleep and the self operates independently of that physical body. The physical body is doing whatever it's doing while you're dreaming and flying around and fighting wars and meeting people and whatever, right?
You're not even aware that it exists.
Mm-hmm.
You're not aware of your physical body. It doesn't exist. And yet you are.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Now, physical science would say, well, that's just, it's just
chemicals.
The firing of the
synapses.
I'm losing the words. The synapses in your brain, and it's an echo of the energy from the waking day, and it's just kind of this cleansing process. That's all true on a physical level, for sure. But the yoga system and the theosophical system would say, yeah, and actually, technically, what's happening is in the dream state, you're operating through the quote unquote dream body. That's a vehicle that you operate through, so to speak, in a different kind of space. It's not this three-dimensional space. It's a different kind of space. It's a different kind of time, but that it's not less real. And that's one of the weird parts for people to get their heads around, that those states are considered in Theosophy to be not less real than the waking state. In fact, quite the opposite. Potentially more real, so to speak, or less transitory than the physical.
Of course, all of them still are a part of what is referred to as Maya or illusion. Because besides the ultimate reality that is indefinable, then everything is an illusion, even what the Platonists refer to as three logoi or whatever. From the perspective of that which is undefinable, and we sometimes refer to it as absolute or the absoluteness, everything is then an illusion because everything is constantly subject to change. So one aspect of reality is permanency, absolute permanent. What is absolute permanent? Well, the absolute. Everything that is not the absolute is then an illusion because it has a beginning and an end. And you can extend that and apply that in different directions, of course.
Well, and that's a good way to touch back to the distinction between principle and vehicle, because a principle in and of itself is permanent. It's not something that has a beginning and an end. In the nature of reality, the seven principles are the seven principles. That's just what it is. The vehicular expression of those principles has beginnings and ends. So for any individual, that's a hard way to speak of it, but any individual monad, the expression or manifestation of that monad has a beginning and an end. Every vehicle is going to have a birth and death. It doesn't matter which level of vehicle we're talking about. It's going to have a birth. It's going to have a death. It's made. It's unmade. and then reincarnation processes of different varieties on different levels. But the principles are permanent per se. They're built into the fabric of reality, you could say, right? Yeah. But the vehicles come and go.
Yeah, here's an important thing. Like, for a long time in science, and it's slowly changing, we touched upon that before, they start to bring in the concept of consciousness in terms of perception and stuff like that. So matter was always primal because consciousness has its source in matter. Now, if scientists would rather say consciousness comes through matter than produced by matter, they would get closer. Yes. But the idea now is that there are these ideas, and you find many of those videos on YouTube, for instance, where some scientists say, well, maybe consciousness is primal. Now they make the same mistake in the opposite direction. Consciousness is not primal either. It is the two as one that is primal, because that consciousness cannot even manifest itself without a vehicle, without substance. So that is probably something for far away in the future, but it's already a step forward by saying, okay, actually consciousness is at least as important as the substance, because in reality they are one, and therefore we don't have a word for it, because the word already limits what it is.
Yeah, so. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that's sort of, when we talk about a principle, then we're talking about a permanency, right? And so if you were to remove a principle from reality, if a principle had an end, let's just take a random one, pick whatever one you want, mind, principle of mind. If the principle of mind had a beginning and then it had an end, after it ended, you would never, ever again anywhere have the manifestation of mind. Because the principle has to be there for the manifestation to occur. And so you can say the same thing about consciousness. You can say the same thing about substance per se, matter. It's a way of thinking about the makeup of the universe. It's not to say, we're not saying that substance is something somewhere. We're saying it's a principle. When we talk about the principle of a body, not the vehicle, but when we talk about the principle of a body, we're talking about the idea that a body could exist. Like the sort of potentiality of a body to exist.
Yeah.
And so you can think about it differently than scientists do, because we're in science. I mean, a lot of scientists think abstractly like that, metaphysically like that too, but we're not talking about things. We're talking about the potentiality that allows things to manifest. So all we have to do is observe around us. And if we observe around us, we'll come to the conclusion that there are certain things that are everywhere. There are certain things that seem to manifest everywhere in some way or another. And we can come from that idea to the idea that those specific things must be fundamental principles of the universe. And so spirit, energy, matter, like you brought up, those are kind of the fundamental three things that are always there. So then we make an idea to ourselves that those are part of the absolute, so to speak, right?
Yep. Even in quantum physics for a long time, and there are also different perspectives on it, it was already said, well, matter doesn't actually exist. It's all, you could say, condensed energy. Yeah, that's true. That's a purely theosophical perspective, because I can also say, instead of saying, well, everything consists of spirit and matter, I can also, or consciousness and matter or substance, I can also say, well, no, there's only consciousness. There's no such thing as matter. But that consciousness, in its manifestation or emanation, becomes denser and denser and denser. At some point, it even drops below our level of consciousness. When that happens, we see it as objective.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually not substance. Everything that surrounds us is condensed consciousness. So from that perspective, you can say there is no two. There is only consciousness. You can turn it around too and say there is no consciousness. Everything is substantial. And you start at a very ethereal level until finally it becomes so dense that you can see it. It's the same thing. What are we arguing about? Learn to
Mm-hmm.
take different perspectives, context, and your problem is solved.
Yeah. And that's where the theosophical view of the co-eternal nature of spirit and matter, that they are
Yeah.
essentially one,
Yeah.
is all important, because in consciousness and matter aren't separate realities. It's not like there's two realities that make up our universe. There's one reality, and we can observe that one reality seems to have two fundamental aspects which give rise to consciousness and matter. And that's represented in how we understand the principles of man, that there's consciousness side, substance side, so to speak, and that takes on different functions, and for each of those functions we can list a principle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And at present in our evolution, although those two are one, non-dual, in us, in our present state of evolution, they become distinct, not separate, but distinct. Just like you can say, my arm is not separate from my shoulder, hopefully, but it's definitely distinct. This is not my shoulder. This is not my arm. They're distinct and they function together. Right? And even if you try and discover really to see where is the difference then between the two, you're going to have to be looking for a long time to say, oh, here the arms start. Oh, no, no, look, it's a little bit, a fraction of a millimeter. No, you can argue about it ad infinitum, They're distinct here and here, but they're connected. So they're not separate. So it's all a matter of context, how you look at things. One of the most fundamental elements of, you could say, esoteric investigation is that aspect of context. Why? Because it connects everything into a unity. And everything is what it is, depending on how you look at it. If I'm standing at the coast here and I say the sun is going down, is that correct or is that incorrect? From my perspective, I'm standing still.
Mm-hmm.
The sun is going down. But if I can take a more cosmic perspective, then I notice that it's actually the globe I'm standing on is turning. But that is then true from a higher perspective. But my perspective on the physical plane is just as true as any other truth. But it's relative truth.
Yeah.
And contextual.
Yeah. Contextual truth. Yeah, exactly.
And you can apply that to 10,000 different things. Get over it.
Yeah, exactly. Stop fighting with each other about things and just start learning to flex our minds a bit. And yeah. Okay, so we've been talking for a while. I think we've gone through the principles really well. I was thinking of ending on a question, and I'm just going to throw a question at you and see what your take is on it. That is, why is it important to know about these principles? We have a conversation all metaphysically and all these things, and sometimes the response I hear is, you're just talking metaphysics, you're just talking all these abstract ideas, what's the point? So what is the point? Like, why is it good to know about these things?
Well, it goes back to the idea, why are we here in the first place? And so the problem is then, who am I actually? And basically, like it was on the cap of the Greek temple of Apollo in Delphi, man, know thyself. And thyself there is not only the highest self, every one of those 7 selves, so to speak. So why are we here? Well, to learn, to experience, to learn to know ourselves. And by knowing ourselves, we will also eventually learn what others are, whether that be animals or whatever, or plants or other human beings. It doesn't really matter. Even the elements, there is an access to the ability to know all of that truly as it is. That's the reason why we're here. And that starts by knowing ourselves. But, a question like that, no question can be answered with a couple of sentences. Everything is so vast in its approach, And especially
Exactly.
from a theosophical perspective, whatever you say, it's always limited. You can never express the truth in a single sentence or a word because those are limitations. Why do we give a name to something? To distinguish it from something else, which means to limit it from something else. And that's true in our investigations as well. Therefore, the Buddhists say Namo Namo, no names anymore. Yeah, you got to
Yeah.
talk about something, and then you give it a name.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I like it because, on a very practical level, even think of, how popular and important psychology is today. If you don't know anything about yourself, you're going to have a hard time navigating a lot of basic things in life. You start to understand a little bit like, oh, I've got this mind and this mind operates a certain way and the emotions operate a certain way. And, a lot of the meditation teachings you get from Buddhism and yoga and stuff, they have a very base level practical application. You start to figure out what's going on in yourself, and outwardly you manage life a little better. So even on the basic level, it's beneficial to know these things. The explanation of the principles, what I find for myself is learning about the principles like this and having a bit of a deeper, more metaphysical understanding of them helps to put in context the different aspects of ourselves. It's like, how is the operation of consciousness working through me right now? What is this actually that's happening? Even like the tiniest insights into that have a cascading effect in your life, right?
Of course, some people might say, well, but what's the point? Because when we die, then it's over. No matter how well you knew yourself, over and done with. But that's a discussion for the future. Because,
Exactly.
yeah, okay, if we really knew that there was nothing, then you just have to, if you fall back on your basic animal instincts and that's how you express yourself in life, fine. There is no law that can keep you from doing that. Nobody says because you're coincidentally here alive that you have listened to human laws and respect them. Nobody can say that because we all die and then it's done. But what if it's not? Then that knowing ourselves is something that evolves through future existences. And
Mhm.
you run with that or you don't, but then draw the conclusions from it as well.